about right through here. Well, that's where I'm trying to go. You know, when we were like, all of these on one side. Oh, okay. Okay.
If there's no one around, you don't know who's coming.
Okay. Okay.
Now, well, I can walk down there and open the door.
Sure. I don't know my way around. I mean, I just don't know which was in there one day.
Well,
This morning, how is one? Well, good to see you.
Test, test, test. How we doing? All right, does anyone need a book? Because we have books. And we only have November lessons left, so we might as well use our books. So if anybody wants one, we can supply it. Let's do our missionary care prayer this morning. The person that we are praying for is Amy Tustin. If we can have some guys, we got three clipboards to pass around this morning up here on the front row, if we could have 3 people to get those passed around. Amy Tustin is our missionary that we are praying for today. She is featured on the back of our bulletin. You'll see her picture on the clipboard that comes around. I don't see them all, but I happen to see the mission request that Amy made when she was introducing herself to the missionary committee here. And Amy is a young lady who is just on fire for the Lord and His kingdom. She became a Christian, decided she would prepare herself to help others become Christians, and she took some time and some education doing that. She is from New Brighton, Pennsylvania, but she already, before she became a Christian there, she was already an influential person in the community because of her longtime associations, family associations, business associations that she had. So what she wanted to do was to be able to spread the word of the kingdom with people in her area, personal one-to-one. And so she is excited about doing that. And for us, then, is a new missionary that is being helped. She's new this year for us. So we pray for Amy and the work that she'll be doing in New Brighton, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding area. She went to Sunset International Bible School, graduating this last May, and she's chosen that section of the Northeast United States to work in the kingdom. So let's have a prayer for Amy, and then we will begin, then we'll do the rest of our class. Our Father in heaven, we are thankful that Amy came to know you and to have such zealousness concerning the good news of Jesus and of His kingdom. We are impressed with the way that she has prepared herself to be able to share the good news that she so loves with others. So bless her as she has a new mission in a place that's familiar to her in New Brighton, Pennsylvania, and around that area. We're thankful that you are using her contacts, her gifts, the relationships that she has, in order that others might come to know Jesus in a saving way as she has. So bless her in that good work. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we have our Bibles open today to Proverbs chapter 16. And again, we have some people coming in. Anybody want a book? Because we got books, and we might as well use them, the Proverbs books. You want one of these, Don Allen? Anybody else want them back here? Okay. There we go. Anybody else? There you go. Okay, there you go, Miss Betty. And we today are on page 17. Page 17. Watch your words. We're doing Proverbs 16, verses 20 through 33. The way that we've been doing this Proverbs study has not been verse by verse. We have taken sections of the book of Proverbs. The sections that we have chosen to do are some sections of Proverbs that, when you read the book of Proverbs, jumps out at you that there are a lot of connected proverbs along the same theme gathered into a short section of the book of Proverbs. A lot of the Proverbs seem to be rather random in the book of Proverbs, but sometimes the book of wisdom gets on a roll and has a lot of proverbs on the same theme or that touch the same areas and relationships of our lives. So we've been doing sections. So rarely do we have a whole chapter to cover. But Proverbs chapter 16, we covered the first half last week in a message about how the Lord is sovereign over our plans and about delighting our leaders and how leaders need to remember that God is the great shepherd. He's the great leader. We can make our plans, but he's the one who works out his will in the world. So we did that last time, and we left off at chapter 16 and verse 32. So today, we're picking, in verse 19, today, we're picking up in verse 20 and doing the rest of the chapter. The thing that ties these Proverbs together is the tongue. This is all about our mouth, the way that we say things, or the way that we need to say things, the way that we shouldn't say things. And the book of Proverbs is full of sayings about the tongue, about our choice of words. This is just an especially rich section for that. So what we're going to do is we'll read verses 20 through 24, and you'll recognize almost every one of these Proverbs has something to say about the way we say things. Proverbs chapter 16, and we'll read verses 20 through 24, and then talk about those things. Whoever gives thought, you know what? I forgot our song, and I always like to sing a song. I knew something wasn't right. So, I'll say a song puts our mind and heart in the right place. So let's turn to number 719. 719. We will sing the song, and it's the Love One Another, Angry Words song that talk about the way that we should be speaking to one another and ways that we shouldn't speak to one another. So we'll do the first and the last verse, 719. 719. First and last verse. Angry words, oh, let them never from my tongue unbridled slip. May the heart's best impulse ever check them ere they soil the lip. Love one another, thus saith the Savior. Children, obey the Father's blessed command. Love one another, thus saith the Savior. Children, obey the blessed command. Let our words be sweetly spoken. Let kind thoughts be greatly stirred. Show our love to one another with abundance of kind words. Love one another, thus saith the Savior. Children, obey the Father's blessed command. Love one another, thus saith the Savior. Children, obey the blessed command. All right, so there's our message today in the words of a song. Now, Proverbs chapter 16, beginning at verses 20. Right now we'll do through verse 24. Whoever gives thought to the word will discover good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. The wise of heart is called discerning, and sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. Good sense is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the instruction of fools is folly. The heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips. Gracious words are like a honeycomb, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. So we'll talk about those particular phrases and proverbs. One thing that I did in our book is to list some of the positive words that are used in this passage to describe the way that we talk, because we do want to remember that this is not just a collection of one verse Proverbs sermons about how we shouldn't say something. There's a lot of instruction here about how we should say something. We have some positive messages here. And so we are told, for instance, in verse 21, one of the words, and by the way, what I did in this section in our book, sometimes people ask me, the Bible translation that I bring up here is the English Standard Version, ESV. But in this section, I did some comparing with the ESV and the NIV, and so I used words from both in this little section. But in verse 21, one of the words that is used is the word discerning. Verse 21 says, the wise of heart is called discerning in verse 21. Connected to verse 20, which is before it, we were told to be a people who give thought to the word, and we'll discover good, and we're to trust in the Lord. And as we look at the Lord's word, this is about our words, about our communication. The Lord has spoken to us. The Lord has communicated to us. And we are to be discerning concerning His word. We're to give that some thought. So be a people who listen closely to the Lord. Let the Lord speak. Let him be heard through our ears and into our hearts. But that also applies to our conversation with one another. We want to be discerning with one another as well, which is a good place to start with talking both of those things, because the message is that in order to be a good talker, first you need to be a good listener. So be a person who listens. When Patty at one time had some kind of chronic health issues, they were minor ones, not a big thing, but she did want to seek some relief from some difficulties she had, and went to several different doctors trying to find some help, and wasn't getting much help. So we made an appointment with a doctor who was an hour and a half away, but somebody recommended him. And so we went to his office, and I'll never forget what happened, because I've never seen a doctor do this before or since. He asked Patty what was going on with her, and she took a little while to describe just what was happening and what she had tried and that sort of thing. And then he sat there and kind of looked off in the distance, and he didn't say a word. And that went on for an uncomfortable amount of time, when you're sitting there and somebody's not speaking. And after a little bit, he spoke, and he said, pardon me for just a minute, I'm just thinking. And that really impressed us that day, that the doctor would do that. He had listened without interruption to what she had to say, and then he just kind of wanted to go through the file in his mind and think about what might be out there and what he could do. And so one of the things that made us appreciate him is, before he spoke and talked about what to do, he was, first of all, a good listener. So we want to be good listeners with one another. We want to be a discerner. We want to listen to God and discern the instruction that He gives us for the good of our lives and our souls. But we also want to be a discerner of what other people are trying to say to us. So here are some other words in verse 21, phrases that are used either in the ESV or the NIV. One is, when we do speak, then listen first, discern, give some thought, and then let your speech be sweet. Sweetness of speech is the phrase that's used. Sweetness of speech increases persuasiveness. The NIV says pleasant speech increases persuasiveness. Sweetness of speech does have somewhat to do with our words that we choose. It also has to do with the tone of voice with which we speak. We can be gentle or we can be harsh. And not only that, but also our body language can communicate to someone whether we're being hard and difficult against what they say, whether it can indicate whether we're listening or not, or if we're talking, it can communicate either some softness or some harshness. So we need to be aware of those things, and all of those things go together to make up sweetness of speech, a pleasant speech, which then serves to be persuasive to the other person about the thing that we are saying. When there is some sort of communication going on, and especially if there's been some conflict, then instead of letting that conflict spring out in our tone and our words, then if we can be sweet about that and pleasant about that, then that helps in the powers of persuasion to bring people around to the point of view that we are trying to communicate. So being persuasive, promoting instruction is what we are trying to accomplish. Because here's what some people do. Some people want to say what they have to say, and they think the way that they can best communicate it and get that into the head of the person they're talking to is by some sort of intimidation. And maybe the louder they are, or the more strident they are in what they say, then maybe they'll be heard. But the book of Proverbs informs us that if we really want to be persuasive, if we want to win the other person, then it's going to need to be with a total understanding of the sweetness of speech in our words, in our tone, and in our body language. We don't want to win someone over to our point of view just by wearing them down with intimidation. That's not going to accomplish much in the end and be a winning thing. In verse 22, the phrase fountain of life is used. That's a phrase that occurs every once in a while in the book of Proverbs. Good sense, we're told, is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the instruction of fools is folly. So we can share with other people, maybe when we're thinking about in a work situation or in a parent-to-child situation. Sometimes we just want to shake our finger and instruct, but to instead take just the way of communicating good sense, the thing that's good, the thing that's right, communicating that in a persuasive way, paying attention to the tone of our speech, listening thrown in there as well, then that's all helpful and good. One of the tricks that a therapist will give to couples who are having trouble communicating is to have the couple sit together and go through, and this really seems contrived when you're practicing it with the therapist that's there, and it can seem contrived when you first do it on your own, but if it becomes sort of a second nature, then you can take the structure out of it, and it doesn't seem as awkward. But people do need to go through this exercise if they don't do things this way. They'll have a couple. This couple has had conflict. They've been arguing. They've not been using sweetness of speech, and they've been hard against one another's opinion, and they feel like the other person's not listening. So the therapist has them go through this exercise. One person has a certain amount of time, maybe it's 3 minutes, to say what they want to say. And the other person sits there and listens, doesn't interrupt, doesn't get distracted, but looks at that person in their face and in their eye and gives them full attention while that person says whatever it is that they want to say, whatever they've been trying to communicate. And then the doctor instructs that person who's been doing the listening to say this: I heard you say, and then repeat to that first person what they heard. They don't have to do verbatim the same words, but they do have to communicate, this is what I heard. When you told me that, this is what I got out of it. This is what I heard. And the person who did the original talking sits through that, without interrupting, without correcting, without saying, no, 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 that's not. Instead, they listen to what that person says till they finish. And then when they're finished, then the person who did the original talking can say, yes, that is what I was trying to say. Or they might say, no, that wasn't what I was trying to say. Let me try again. And you just keep going back and forth like that. Eventually, the other person gets the opportunity to be the original talker. But you see in that exercise that what's going on is just this emphasis on communication that begins with being a listener, but then speaking things in a way that is not accusatory, but just stating what it is that you want to say, confident that you're heard. So that sort of exercise goes on, and we can hear that sort of exercise in the description of these proverbs as people begin with discerning, talk about listening, letting the other person speak, receiving the word that they have, responding to it in a good way. James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20 says to be slow to anger, slow to speech, quick to listen. These things all go together. And when we do that, when we have that kind of communication, then that becomes this fountain of life. Now instead of being estranged and feeling like we're not heard and we don't get our chance to speak and we don't understand what the other person's doing or why, now this becomes a fountain of life for our relationship. And so, verse 23 says that our words are to be judicious. Sometimes we need to weigh our words, understand that words are important, and our word choice itself is important. So weigh our words, use this mouth that is guided by wisdom, and this wonderful Bible word, be gracious in the things that we say. The New Testament says, let your speech always be seasoned with salt, gracious towards one another. So we want our speech to be gracious, both on the listening end and on the talking end. And when that happens, then what we end up with is, and this is a wonderful phrase at the end of verse 24, sweetness to the soul and health to the body. Our souls are refreshed, our physical lives are refreshed when we have good communication with one another. But we have to pay attention to those things. Healing to the body and healing to the bones is the sort of communication that we want. So those are positive phrases. Be discerning, have sweetness of speech, be pleasant. This leads to true persuasiveness. It promotes real instruction. It's a fountain of life. It's judicious. It's a mouth guided by wisdom. Graciousness is involved. It's sweet to the soul, like honeycomb, tastes good and is good for you. And so it brings health to the body and healing to the bones. But now, we're going to skip a couple of verses. We'll come back to those other verses. But let's skip down to verse 27. Beginning in verse 27 and reading through verse 30, now these proverbs take a negative turn. Rather than speaking in a positive way about how we should speak to one another, now we get some proverbs about how we should not be speaking to one another. So we're going to read verses 27 through 30. A worthless man plots evil, and his speech is like a scorching fire. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. A man of violence entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that is not good. Whoever winks his eye plans dishonest thing. He who purses his lips brings evil to pass. So we have then, instead of graciousness, honeycomb, health, There are people who their speech is more described like a scorching fire. They just leave a scorched earth behind them when they go on their rant about the things that they want to say. And it's harmful to people, and it's harmful to relationships, accomplishes no good. It tears down instead of builds up. It's discouraging instead of encouraging. So we don't want to be that scorched fire person. Nor do we want to be the whisperer, the gossip, the slanderer. And what can happen in those situations is that even people who've been close friends, when you throw a third person in there who is a divisive person who somehow gets a charge out of seeing drama, and maybe is the sort of person, they can't have two friends, they have to have one friend or another, so they have to break up a friendship in order to receive one of those friendships. There are those kinds of people in the world, and a whisperer, a gossip, will speak to one person in ways that are negative about the other person, but then they'll go to that other person and talk in negative ways about the other one in the party, and they can cause harm in these relationships. And so when someone begins to talk to us about someone that we know and care about and love, but what they're saying are things that are unfriendly and to be taken in a bad way, then just like we want to be judicious and weigh our own words, sometimes we need to be judicious and discerning, weigh the words of the other person, and realize what's going on there is a destructive thing that we shouldn't be participating in. People can use words to entice other people to evil. And in verse 30, what we're warned about, it's really a warning about watching the other person, because there are the tells, the signs that another person is being dishonest, that they're pulling a con. There are some body language things that we can look out for. And so a person who says something to be taken as fact, but then gives that wink at the end, what they're saying by that wink is what I've said is not true, or they purse their lips. So be aware of people who are using sarcasm and cynicism and outright lies in order to either entice us down a wrong path or to bring strife to another relationship that we have. Just be aware of all of those things. There is a little section in here that's not so much about the way that we talk, but it's still connected to the mouth. So let's read a few of those words. We're going to go back to verse 25. And this time we will read, even though we read verses 27 to 30, we'll include those again. But we'll read verses 25 to the end of the chapter, the rest of these Proverbs about our mouth. Sometimes it's speech, but sometimes it's other things. Verse 25 is, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. That's a familiar one among a lot of us. Verse 26, a worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. A worthless man plots evil, and his speech is like a scorching fire. A dishonest man spreads strife, and a whisperer separates close friends. A man of violence entices his neighbor and leads him in a way that's not good. Whoever winks his eye plans dishonest things. He who purses his lips brings evil to pass. Gray hair is a crown of glory. It is gained in a righteous life. Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. In that section of the book of Proverbs, beginning with especially that in verse 25, the way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. That's why we need to be listening to the Lord as our first proverb today said, we need to be discerning about the Lord and His word and its good word because there is such a thing as a way that seems right to us, but its end is the way of death. Sometimes it is difficult for us to know in any given situation what's the good thing and what's the bad thing. So in this little section of the book of Proverbs, we have these thoughts. Hunger can be a bad thing. We're sad when someone is hungry. We want to do something about it. We want to supply food. But in the proverb that is given here in verse 26, a worker's appetite, and it's not just talking about food hunger, but we have other kinds of hunger as well. But a worker's appetite works for him. His mouth urges him on. One of the things that encourages us to be a people of good work ethic, a people who plan ahead and work ahead. And you know the book of Proverbs has a whole lot to say about that. Consider the ant who works. Don't be the sluggard. So our hunger, our mouth actually works for us because it keeps us working. If we're gonna eat, we need to work. So our mouth and the hunger that we feel moves us in that kind of good direction. Also, there is the situation where gray hair might seem like a sign of frailty. And I don't say this just because I have gray hair. Joe Chesser and I have had gray hair. He's 10 years younger than I am, but we both got our gray hair very early. But the gray hair can be a sign of age, and therefore we might associate frailty with that or feebleness. But we're reminded as we speak to others that the gray hair is a sign also of experience and wisdom, and so it can be a good thing. We live in a youth-oriented society, so maybe I shouldn't tell this, but she's passed on and probably wouldn't care so much anyway. She didn't care so much about these things. But my grandmother lived well into her 80s. My mother's mother lived well into her 80s. And she always had dark hair. She didn't say much about how she kept her dark hair except for one comment she made to me one time. She said, "As long as I can raise my hand to my head, I will not have gray hair." So that's the way that she took care of it. But gray hair, instead of covering it up, gray hair can be a sign of wisdom and experience, and therefore we want to honor that. And then sometimes people think that muscular strength, to be a person who can get their own way just by power and might, that's the good thing. But the proverb that we read said, no, the person who has the strength to control their own spirit, to discipline their own body, to police their own words, that's the person that is strong and should be appreciated and respected. I will mention the last verse, verse 33. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Takes us back to chapter 16 and verse 1. The plans of the heart belong to man, but the answer of the tongue is from the Lord. So there are kind of some bookend verses there that hold in these themes that we've been doing. And I saved about 10 minutes here to do an exercise that I like to do. Sometimes I get this Bible out. I generally do have the ESV. This is an NIV, if that's what you use. I mentioned in our book that an exercise that we can do is to begin in Proverbs chapter 10, because Proverbs makes a switch in its literary ways from the first 9 chapters to the beginning of the 10th chapter and the rest of what goes on. So beginning in Proverbs chapter 10, here's how this came about for me. I had this sense that the book of Proverbs had a whole lot to say about the tongue, about the way we use our words. So one day I thought, well, I think I'll just read through the book of Proverbs, and I wonder if I'll find something about the tongue or the way that we use our words in every chapter. I wonder, maybe there's a verse in every chapter about that. And here's what I thought would happen. I knew there was enough stuff about the tongue in the book of Proverbs. I would probably find something about the tongue in a lot of chapters. But I thought I would probably run into a chapter or two that didn't have anything to say about it. Or maybe I could find a verse in there that sort of indirectly spoke something of the tongue so I could make it fit. So I was preparing myself to look to those verses. But then when I read through the book of Proverbs and marked them, the problem was not running across a chapter that didn't have something to say about the tongue and trying to find something that indirectly maybe could say something about it. The problem was finding just one proverb in each chapter that spoke about the tongue. Because every chapter, as we have put out, as we've made our chapters, God didn't make those, we did, but every chapter has something to say about the tongue. So it's a good exercise to go through, and we're going to do that in the few moments that we have. We won't have time for me to do much preaching and teaching on each one, so we'll just read through them. So you can follow along with me. Proverbs chapter 10, we're going to start in Proverbs chapter 10 and go all the way through the end of the book. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 11 says, "The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life." Sounds like what we just read in Proverbs 16, doesn't it? "The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but violence overwhelms the mouth of the wicked." We can give life or we can tear down with wickedness. Chapter 11 and verse 11, chapter 11 and verse 11. "Through the blessing of the upright, a city is exalted. By the mouth of the wicked, it's destroyed." And whatever structures are around us, not just walled cities, relationships, we can either build those up or we can tear them down. Chapter 12 and verse 6. "The words of the wicked lie in wait for blood, but the speech of the upright rescue them." We can destroy people or we can rescue people with our words. Chapter 13, and here is verse 3. Chapter 13 and verse 3. "He who guards his lips guards his life, but he who speaks rashly will come to ruin." We don't need to say everything that it occurs to us to say. Guard our lips. Chapter 14 and verse 3. "A fool's talk brings a rod to his back, but the lips of the wise protect them." Sometimes for our own good, we just need to not say something. Chapter 15, a famous one, verse 1. Chapter 15 and verse 1. "A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." Chapter 16 and verse 13. And by the way, we had this verse in last week's lesson. "Kings take pleasure in honest lips. They value a man who speaks the truth." And we mentioned about multiple verses about the tongue in every chapter. Our chapter today is the last, the second part of chapter 16, and it was all about the tongue. Chapter 17 and verse 27. "A man of knowledge uses words with restraint, and a man of understanding is even-tempered." Chapter 18, verse 13. "He who answers before listening, that is his folly and his shame." Listen before we speak. Chapter 19. I'm going to do verses 5 and verse 9 because they're almost the same. I think just one word changes. "A false witness will not go unpunished, and he who pours out lies will not go free. That's verse 5. Verse 9 is, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who pours out lies will perish. Chapter 20 and verse 15. Gold there is, and rubies in abundance, but lips that speak knowledge are a rare jewel. Better to find that than gold, much rarer. Chapter 21 and verse 21. He who guards his mouth and his tongue keeps himself from calamity. Chapter 22, verse 11. He who loves a pure heart and whose speech is gracious will have the king for his friend. Chapter 23 and verse 15. My son, if your heart is wise, then my heart will be glad. My inmost being will rejoice when your lips speak what is right. Chapter 24 and verse 26. An honest answer is like a kiss on the lips. When someone that we love gives us that kiss on the lips, it gives us a thrill. Well, when somebody gives us an honest answer, it's the same kind of effect. Chapter 25 and verse 11. A word aptly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. I want to talk about that one for a moment. I'm not a painter. I have trouble coloring inside the lines myself, but I do appreciate those who can paint. One of the things that I've noticed a lot of painters practice on is they take a bowl of fruit, put it on a table, and they paint the fruit, and it does make for a beautiful picture. And you can take that painting then and hang it on the wall. It enhances the wall, makes the room and the house a more beautiful place. Well, what this proverb says is that when somebody speaks the right word, it's like a beautiful picture of golden apples. Think about a still life painting that's put in a wonderful silver frame, and then that frame is hung on the wall, and it makes the house just a more beautiful place. Well, those of us who can't paint, we can do that same thing with our words. We can make the place where we are a more beautiful place by the beauty of our words. Chapter 26 and verse 20. Without wood, a fire goes out. Without gossip, a quarrel dies down. Chapter 27 and verse 2. Let another praise you and not your own mouth, someone else, not your own lips. Boasting is never attractive. Chapter 28 and verse 23. He who rebukes a man will in the end gain more favor than he who has a flattering tongue. Chapter 29 and verse 20, 29-20. Do you see a man who speaks in haste? There's more hope for a fool than for him. Slow to speak. Chapter 30 and verse 11. There are those who curse their fathers and do not bless their mothers. The honor our parents passage needs to include the words that we speak to them and about them. And chapter 31. Look there. There's the bell, and we're in chapter 31 and verse 26. The wonderful woman speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. And that's a good way to end our lesson today. Next week will be from Proverbs 23, drink the wine of wisdom.